This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shendlin.
Joining us from New York. Every week, Dahlia and I bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we are counting on you. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, focused on democracy, populism, authoritarianism, and all of its causes, symptoms, manifestations, etc.
And possible cures, which we'll be discussing today. We're very pleased today to welcome Professor Stephen B. Smith. Stephen Smith received his PhD from the University of Chicago. He has taught at Yale since 1984 and is the Alfred Coles Professor of Political Science. He's speaking to us today from New Haven. His research is focused on the history of political philosophy, with special attention to the problems of the ancients and the moderns, the relation of religion and politics, theories of representative government, and many more topics. He has published numerous books, too numerous even for us to count, and we'll be discussing his most recent one, Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes, published by Yale University Press in 2021. Professor Smith, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I want to start by observing that in reading this book, it reads to me like a sort of like as if you're in dialogue with certain social forces, and this is your contribution to the dialogue, and the name states it pretty clearly, you're reclaiming patriotism. Why was it important to you to make this contribution? What were you responding to in the social discourse today, or what you see in political trends today?
Thanks, Dahlia, for asking me that. It's a good place to start. I am a political theorist by training, and that's what I do for a living here at Yale. And the question of patriotism is something you would think that would be central to this subject. What we owe our country would be central to the subject of the study of politics. And yet it is oddly neglected by our field. And it is a question that goes back to the beginnings of political philosophy. It was a question raised by Socrates at the beginning. But today, patriotism, and what I'm responding to exactly, has two alternatives or two sides that each represent challenges to the question of what we owe our country. The one that is most commonly found in universities and I would say educated circles more broadly is that we are citizens of the world. We are part of a global world held together by commerce and trade and other things, and that we owe no particular allegiance to this country or that country because we are citizens of the world. We are moving on this view into a kind of transnational world where states and sovereigns and borders will be relegated to a thing of the past. This was a kind of utopianism that grew out of the post-Cold War period and which remained very dominant and still is dominant in intellectual circles.
Even though it didn't really work out very well.
Really work out, but it's still, not entirely disappear either. Of course, the EU has remained a kind of model for what a kind of transnational association would look like. And, we deal with global problems all the time, climate change, pandemics, et cetera. So there's an idea that the problems facing the world are increasingly global and transcend our national commitments and loyalties. That's all on one side. On the other side, the movement that has received a lot of renewed attention in the last few years has been the rise of a kind of virulent nationalism in different parts of the world, including the U.S., clearly, with Trumpism, MAGA, the MAGA movement. The idea that nations owe nothing to anything else, to anybody else. It's us against them. The world is a jungle that needs constant which involves constant conflict and with other states, and that the national identity is the only source of meaning and loyalty. Our national identity. This always goes, again, with a kind of ideology of us against them, as well as an ideology of grievance and resentment. And I wanted to write a book that would push back against both of these extremes, which I think challenge patriotism and which challenge what a kind of, I would say, decent love of country requires of us.
But why is it so important? Why is reclaiming patriotism really that central to you? Why not do away with it altogether? Say it might have been a thing of the past. It's much less en vogue than it was, a few decades ago, if not less. It was nice while it lasted. Why does it need to be reclaimed?
Good. Well, and of course, many people would say it wasn't even nice while it lasted. But patriotism, as I argue in my book, is a form of loyalty. It is part, in fact, of a structure of loyalties or a series of loyalties that begin, you might say, with the family, is the most fundamental unit of loyalty, and sort of works out from there. Our loyalties define who we are. We are loyal to families. We are loyal to institutions. We are loyal to sports teams. We are loyal to religious groups. We are loyal to country. It is part of a series of or structure of loyalties that define us. And I want to argue, Gilad, that as much as many of us think, not me, but many people think that patriotism has kind of run its course, that as long as we are political animals, so long as we are members of states, and that may disappear, who knows what the future will bring, but so long as we are, loyalty to country is a very defining part of our identity. And in fact, it's something that the states we live in, which I believe are of value, deep value, cannot do without. So I try to connect patriotism as a form of loyalty to, again, the sort of deep structures of loyalty that make up human psychology and make up who we are as human beings.
I want to discuss that sort of binary opposition that you set up in the beginning between what you consider sort of extremes, extreme nationalism, having kind of somehow subsumed patriotism under this virulent and dangerous force. And on the other hand, what you sometimes refer to as cosmopolitanism, but also rooted in progressive and universalist values that go too far into extreme identity politics of the left. I think that characterizes how you look at the extremes. Do you view them as equal forces of extremism? Or are they equally dangerous from your perspective, or is there an imbalance? Is one more problematic than the other?
Right. I think it's a great question. Thank you for that. I think that there's not a clear answer to that. I do think there's a sort of shifting balance of forces between them. When I began thinking about this book, and actually, even though it's a short book, I began thinking about it quite a long time ago. I would say the forces of cosmopolitanism were riding very high in the world, and that was the dominant kind of challenge to patriotism as I saw it. I think the balance has shifted a bit in the last decade or even less towards nationalism. We've seen how nationalism has begun to reemerge after being kind of submerged part of our political world for quite a while. We've begun to see how nationalism has begun to emerge in parts of Eastern Europe. I'm thinking particularly of Hungary and Poland, certainly in Russia and China, Brazil. so many places. India. I mean, nationalism has always been a powerful force, at least since the early 19th century. It's been a powerful force for political organization and political mobilization, and it has not always been a malignant force. Far from it. The 19th century, in particular, was filled with what we might call liberal forms of nationalism. One of the great Israeli political theorists, Yuli Tamir, wrote a brilliant book. A student of Isaiah Berlin, who was a kind of liberal nationalist himself. But Yuli wrote a great book called Liberal Nationalism, and she's come out with another one a little more recently, Why Nationalism.
And just to say that she was a guest on our podcast a few months ago.
That doesn't surprise me. And her version of liberal nationalism, as she calls it, is really not so different from what I call patriotism. The problem, as I see it, is that liberal nationalism is and I think she would agree with me on this, is a very, very endangered species. And I would even argue that there is a tendency, and a powerful tendency within nationalism, to evolve, as it were, into various forms of what we might think of as ethno and racial nationalism. It's very difficult to maintain that balance between sort of liberal democracy and nationalism, although, again, it's not impossible. In the 19th and early parts of the 20th century, had many noble examples of this. But nationalism has a tendency to devolve into this kind of us, and the world is composed of friends and enemies. It's us and them. And and that sense of conflict between us and them inevitably becomes internalized into domestic life, into distinguishing domestic others, not just foreign nationals, but domestic nationals who are
the enemy within, right?
Enemy within, whether this is a racial group, an ethnic group, whether it's Jews, it's Muslims, it's Mexicans coming across the border. There's a tendency to other people and to dehumanize them, and I feel that is sort of that is inseparable in some ways from the nationalist idiom.
I'd like to spend some more time on this and ask you, is there a really theoretical distinction between patriotism and nationalism, or are they just two phenomena on the same spectrum with varying degrees of intensity, and vice versa? Is patriotism perhaps a benign form of nationalism?
One of the things I wanted to avoid doing in my book is to putting these categories in independent silos, and in a way that maybe a philosopher would be more comfortable with, trying to set up a neat analytical distinction between the three of them and showing where they're distinct. In fact, what I try to do, and I draw here on probably my favorite, I think maybe the greatest political theorist who ever lived, Aristotle. Aristotle said in describing the virtues, he said all virtues were a question of finding a mean between two extremes. So if you want to understand what courage is, you have to understand it as a mean between rashness on the one side and cowardice or kind of timidity on the other side. And the virtues took the form of a kind of continuum between the two. It's sometimes difficult to say where one ends and the other begins, because they do, at the margins at least, they shade into one another. And I began to think of patriotism along these lines. Of course, there is a sense in which patriotism and nationalism, they do grow out of, as I argue in the book, they grow out of a kind of common concern, which is to say a desire to have your culture, your way of life strong and respected. That's a natural and I think quite legitimate sentiment. But I want to argue, while they grow out of a common root, they tend to, beginning from a common root, they move in different directions. The difference between cosmopolitanism and patriotism might seem clearer, a more clear-cut distinction. But at least in the American case, and the book is really written in many ways about the American case, our sense of nationhood and peoplehood, which we usually think derives from the Declaration of Independence, has a powerful universalist drive to it. All men are created equal, it says in the inalienable rights. These are not the products of one people. They have a kind of cosmopolitan dimension to them. And the American founders were very concerned, or attempted to strike a kind of balance between a sense of universal rights and universal claims about equality, with the sense of creating a distinct people and a distinct nation. So these categories do in a way blend and touch on one another in the way sort of you could imagine them as being part of a kind of Venn diagram, where there are parts of them that do overlap with each other rather than constituting independent silos. So I agree, and I think there is a degree of overlap, and yet I want to say they are at the same time they do speak in distinct and in quite different languages.
Well, I want to propose that you may be selling your ideas short, because when I read the book, I thought that you, or at least you raised, or at least prompted me to think of very qualitative and substantive differences between the two that maybe don't contradict the idea of a continuum, but at least I want to throw a couple out at you that I thought about while reading it and see if you agree. So, for example, at one point you write, there's nothing inherently exclusionary or triumphalist about patriotism. It expresses a human need to belong, for service, and for love of one's own. To my mind, I thought, oh, okay, so patriotism can be inclusive and flexible because it doesn't ask who's out as long as I feel that I'm inside and I belong. But it's okay if others are inside as well. Well, couldn't we say that nationalism searches for that boundary between insider and outsider? That's just one idea I had. What do you think of that? Is that a substantive difference?
No, I agree. I think that very much is a substantive difference, and the fact that I say there is a continuum between them is not at all to deny. In fact, the core of the book is that patriotism is different from both of these extremes.
You made the point. If I may, I want to ask you I want to propose my second sort of insight that grew out of the reading on this topic. Okay. And that's that as a student of comparative religion, and a political scientist, I also think that, as you point out in the book, human beings do have tribal identities, or the need to belong. I'm just using that for lack of a better word. And I started to wonder whether the whole question is how we find a framework that either contains or exaggerates that sense of tribal identity. And nationalism seems to exacerbate it, while patriotism can be sort of a healthy way of expressing it, but also containing it. What do you think of that characterization?
I like that. I think that's a very good characterization. Patriotism, on my reading of it, or on my understanding, one of the points I want to make is that, again, patriotism is a form of loyalty. It doesn't require us to think of ourselves as in some kind of relation of competitive advantage with other peoples. I can be, again, if I take loyalty to family as the most, you might say, primordial form of loyalty, loyalty to my family doesn't require me to think that my family is better than every other family. I mean, I think we would immediately think that's a preposterous point of view. We love our families not because we think they're better than others. We love our families often not just despite, but because of their failings and flaws. That's part of who we are. And I think of love of country as something like that. It doesn't require a kind of competitive advantage. Of course, it means that we have certain obligations to fellow citizens, just like to family members that take a kind of priority in the list of priorities. But that doesn't mean, once again, it doesn't mean that my preference, to use an example from the book, that my preference for my child, that my desire to see my child get into a good school, to have a flourishing career, to succeed in life. It's not a desire to see others fail, nor is it a desire that he should, or she, he, my son in this case, that he should succeed by in many ways by excluding or denying others. I mean, I'd be failing in my ability as a parent if I failed to instill some sense of justice and fairness in the way your children act in the world. So I think of patriotism as something like that too. It's a love of one's own. It's a need to belong. It's a form of loyalty. In particular, it's a form of gratitude, which is a term that I use frequently in the book. We have a kind of gratitude to those who have shaped us and who have made us who we are and have shaped our tastes. And this is our country. It shapes who we are, and we have, or we should have, a kind of gratitude for that. And those are the shaping characteristics of patriotism, which I think can be a very inclusive category.
The book, as you yourself admitted just a few minutes ago, is really heavily focused on the United States. And I suspect it's not just because you are American yourself and you live in the United States, and that is, of course, your immediate terms of reference. But is it also because the term is particularly relevant for the political project that the United States is? You did mention the European Union that had some sort of a mitigating effect on patriotism and nationalism in Europe. But is it because the American political project is perhaps like a shark, that it needs to move forward or it dies? And patriotism is perhaps an effective and not really nefarious propeller in this sense that just allows it to move forward.
It's a wonderful metaphor. I remember it from Woody Allen's Annie Hall when he described their relationship as a shark that needs to be moving constantly forward. I really see the American project is endangered at the moment by very negative forces. And the book was written with a desire to sort of reclaim what I think the country should be, the country that, I was more comfortable with when I grew up and when I, in my formative years. One part of American patriotism that, again, is important to the book, and I think in many ways is unique to America, is that our patriotism is of a peculiarly creedal form. We emphasize common beliefs and aspirations that shape American identity. That goes back a very long way. Americans have always been a people of the book. They may differ on which book exactly, but when the Puritans came here, they clearly thought of themselves as a people of the book, creating a kind of new Jerusalem in the wilderness of the new world. The constitutional founders, created the Declaration of wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as texts that define what it means to be an American. And over 2 and 3 centuries, we have continued to develop those texts and to expand and elaborate them. And it is this creedal dimension that America is a country based on ideas, and that those ideas have an aspirational quality. They have never been fully or perfectly realized, but that they represent goals to seek and to achieve. That idea of the American creed, I think, got its most beautiful and powerful expression in the writings of Abraham Lincoln. Those ideas, it seems to me, or that idea of American patriotism is the one that I find under attack, and that needs, in my view, reclaiming. People need to remember these things, and I think we are constantly in danger of forgetfulness, a kind of historical forgetfulness and amnesia. It's very easy to lapse into a kind of moralism that looks at the past as a kind of benighted age from which we need to liberate ourselves. But I think these ideas, this creedal component of American patriotism is the thing that I most importantly wanted to stress.
So to that end, I want to ask you about your chapter on enlightened patriotism, because I think I read that as this sort of, your remedial approach to, rebalancing where America is right now. And it does rest on those aspects that you mentioned: egalitarianism, aspirationalism, and inclusiveness. But I was curious if you can clarify the distinction between that and what you mentioned in the beginning, liberal nationalism. Are they decidedly different, or are they overlapping?
They're probably overlapping in some important way. I don't have really a problem with that, the overlap. It's just that I, as I said earlier, I think liberal nationalism is a much more, the term is more difficult and problematic. How to balance nationalism and liberalism. It was always, in some ways, a difficult balancing act, and one which I think has not been largely, in the world we live in today, at least, has not been largely successful. So, in that respect, I think patriotism is probably closer to what I want to talk about. And another dimension of patriotism, as long as we're on this, that I want to mention also, is that patriotism is something that I think needs to be taught. It's not something we're born with. It's not something that's in our, moral or political DNA. It's something that needs to be taught. And it has fallen out of the curriculum certainly of universities, but increasingly of high schools and grammar schools in America. It's seen as, again, a kind of backward-looking phenomenon. And so students come out of school without in this universities often as well without real heroes to look to, without looking to America as a place where heroes have emerged and who can be people who can be models of a kind of patriotic love of country. And I think the element of education is central to patriotism. The nationalist believes it doesn't make that much difference. It's land and soil. That's the ground. Or it's divine promises somehow. God gave this to us, and that's all we need to do, or all we need to say. Patriotism, again, I think at least in the American version of it, is a very different sentiment, and one that needs to be cultivated, nurtured through texts, through teachers, and by learning.
Tragically, we have to wrap up soon because we have so many more questions, but I want to begin to end by talking about my favorite topic in the world, which is dissent. And you do spend quite a bit of time looking at the ways in which patriotism allows and maybe even calls for forms of self-criticism and dissent. And there was a very nice quote that I'd like to read out. You write, "Patriotism requires us not only to take justified pride in our country's accomplishments, but also to feel justified moral shame at its shortcomings." I found this fascinating. Justified moral shame. What does that mean? And is this another one of those distinctions from nationalism?
Alia, thank you so much for bringing out that sentence and for bringing this up for a conversation. Yes, absolutely. Pride and shame, or gratitude and shame, are two sides of the same coin, it seems to me. One of the standard critiques of patriotism is that it allows no room for self-criticism. It allows no room for doubt or self-criticism. And that seems to me deeply wrong. The patriot is capable, certainly in the American case, it's the one I know best, it's the one I refer to. If you just look at the way in which, to take an example from the book, Congressional Medal of Honor winners who were denied that honor in previous generations because of their race have been posthumously or later acknowledged for their acts of service and heroism to the country. What is that but a form of self-critique, self-criticism, and a broader understanding of who is part of the American family? So I definitely want to argue that a kind of both patriotism has a sense of pride in our accomplishments, that I think that is very important, but pride is inseparable from a sense of shame at our moral failings. And this has become, of course, increasingly important as issues of race and inclusion have occupied our national attention. One of the things I want to push back against in the book is this focus that race and issues of race, is painful as they are, represent somehow the essence of the American character. That's what the 1619 Project that the New York Times is floating is about, saying that we are stained irreparably by slavery and racism. I think this is just as wrong as the people on the nationalist side who want to argue that that there can be no criticism, that there can be really very little room or no room for criticism. A thoughtful patriotism, or as an enlightened patriotism, as I call it in my book, has to be very aware of both the elements of pride and shame that characterize the two dimensions of our patriotic spirit.
I'd like to ask you now about maybe a hybrid form of patriotism and to what extent it is viable. Because in our globalized world, many people have several loyalties to several countries, chiefly migrants, of course. But also, if you look at Israel, which is a case that is of great importance and interest to us, there is some sort of an inherent form of dual loyalty, if you will, to us as Israelis to Israel, our country, and to the Jewish people. And that, of course, applies to Jews in other countries around the world. How do you think people can navigate that? And does it really fall under patriotism, in your view?
Well, one of the things I argue in the book is that as human beings, we have multiple loyalties that goes with being what it is to be human. Loyalty to friends, to family, to co-religionists, to countries, etc. And we have obligations to humanity as well. I don't deny this. Of course, we have multiple and conflicting loyalties. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that there's no algorithm exactly for resolving these conflicts. It always will remain a question of judgment and responsibility. I give a variety of examples in the book of people torn between loyalty to family and loyalty to country. If you take, just to take the oldest example of this, I think, Sophocles' Antigone, which deals with the conflict between what Antigone owes to her family and what to the state. You see, this is a problem that goes deep into the heart of the Western tradition. And it's never been there's no way of solving this. We live in a world. I don't know that this is a tragic thing. This is just the way things are between different obligations and loyalties. And my book is an attempt to argue that loyalty to country is one of those circles of obligation and loyalty. How different people choose to respond to it, how people choose to decide on which side of the conflict they fall or stand, that's going to be up to them, because it's a question for reasoned judgment and deliberation. And I think that's, in a way, the best I can do. My purpose isn't to try to force feed patriotism down people's throats. Even if I could do that, I wouldn't do that. It just goes against the whole spirit of what my book is about. But I do want to show that patriotism, at its best, is what I call an ennobling disposition. It fosters a sense of loyalty. It fosters a sense of civility. It fosters a sense of lawfulness, rule of law, and civility. These are all qualities of the patriotic spirit that I want to try to defend.
Well, I want to say that I think one of the other really helpful things about reading your book was the sense that you are not trying to square circles that can't be squared. And I thought to myself throughout, well, I guess there's nobody here but us humans, and some of this cannot be resolved, and that's something we have to accept. But I think that that's actually doing a great service to the topic. So thank you, Professor Stephen B. Smith. You've been talking to us about your most recent book, Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. I want to thank you for being on the show.
It was my pleasure. It was a great honor. Thank you very much, Gilad and Dahlia. Thank you.
And also many thanks to Ariel Cohen, our producer, and to Itai Shalem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for the partnership and support for this series. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. And, of course, you too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. And check out our archive. It has over 600 interviews, and you can like us on Facebook and follow us, the podcast, as well as me and Dahlia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dahlia, who will be back with us shortly, and from me, goodbye.